The date is October 4th, 2021. It was a cloudy Monday, and I headed to class as usual that day. But I was checking my phone a little bit more than I would normally, because I was missing an event I'd been watching before class. I recall standing outside my 18th century literature class in the English building and doing one final quick Google search before entering, and nearly flipped out reading the headline, Highlights from Bubba Wallace's Historic Win at Talladega. In class, I exclaimed to everyone, "Do y'all know who Bubba Wallace is?" And everyone said, "No, who the hell is that?" And then I said, "The only black NASCAR driver right now, and he just won!" Everyone simply shrugged it off and mumbled things like, "Oh, NASCAR, just cars going in circles," confused how I could care about NASCAR in any capacity. But I didn't think much of it, because Bubba Wallace had just won a NASCAR Cup Series race for Michael Jordan's new race team. It was probably the happiest I'd ever been about anything in a very, very long time. But why exactly was this such a big deal? Well, in order to find out what details my befumbled classmates missed, or simply didn't give a crap about, we have to go back to 2020. June 21st, 2020 specifically, 1 month after the murder of George Floyd and the beginning of race riots across the country, and coincidentally, my birthday. Trending in the headlines was this: a noose being found tied at Talladega in Bubba Wallace's garage stall. This was a very sad thing to see in a time like this, and in a sport with as strong an association with the South as you can have. It was not a good look amidst great change in the sport and the country as a whole. Bubba Wallace had just called on NASCAR to ban the rebel flag at tracks, worn an I Can't Breathe shirt at Atlanta, and driven a Black Lives Matter car at Martinsville, where he almost won. It was very believable that such a threat would be directed toward him individually, not to mention it was, as you could say, on brand for NASCAR. Come race day at Talladega, this is what happened. A beautiful display of the kinship between drivers and the organization in the face of evil. Wallace would go on to then perform dutifully in the race, nearly winning the entire thing. But then, a few days afterward, this happened. The noose was found to have been in that particular garage stall for years, and it was not a show of racist intimidation. In every way, this was good, to know that there wasn't some racist in the garage that was trying to intimidate Bubba Wallace. Though many called on it to be a hoax, the reaction was completely justified due to the trauma associated with the noose as a symbol. First, in order to understand Bubba's reaction, we must look at the fight-or-flight response. As Sandra Bloom puts it in Trauma Theory Abbreviated, the basic internal protective mechanism is called the fight-or-flight reaction. Whenever we perceive we are in danger, our bodies make a massive response that affects all of our organ systems. Though this is typically speaking about a micro-reaction with one person, on a larger scale, the response was felt in Bubba Wallace over the course of the weekend, and with NASCAR, with the events happening across America fresh in everyone's minds. As Bloom also states, each episode of danger connects to every other episode of danger in our minds, so that the more danger we are exposed to, the more sensitive we are to danger. Given the death of George Floyd, Bubba's previous encounters with racism in Southern motorsports, encounters I won't talk about here, but ones you know happened, the historically racist symbolism of a noose, and the collective trauma of black people in the face of prejudice in America, it is only expected that such a reaction be taken by everyone involved. As Bubba said in an interview, it was a noose, regardless if it was tied yesterday or 10 years ago, or with malicious intent or not. After all, what a coincidence for Bubba's number 43 car to be assigned to that specific garage for that weekend in the year of 2020, only a month after the riots began. The chances are 1 in a billion, and yet it happened. Much like the rebel flag, it carries a trauma and a baggage for many in America, memories of an unjust history. And in order for all people to be able to enjoy racing without feeling uncomfortable or unwelcome, a safe space must first be created, and people like Wallace must stand up and do what they can to fight for their place in the sport. And that's exactly what he felt he had to do in the face of a noose as a black man, regardless of context. This reaction is also comparable to Frankie's and Frankie and Alice, as her different personalities were triggered by certain things connected to her trauma, like a song, bright lights, or as mentioned before, danger. There are certain symbols too deeply tied to personally negative experiences to keep a reaction such as the one had by NASCAR and Bubba Wallace following the discovery of the noose. Not to mention, if they didn't come out to the public about it before it was shared on social media, conspiracies and a potential canceling would be up in the air. To say the least, Bubba Wallace was the right man at the right time, in the right place. He's a very outspoken man, encouraging people to have the tough conversations. And he creates testimony about his trauma and pressure. As explained by Alyssa Marder in Trauma and Lit Studies, testimony is to show that even though we do not recover from our traumatic past, nor can we cure it, overcome it, or even fully understand it, we can and we must listen to it and survive it by listening to its effects as they are transmitted to us through the voices of witnesses and survivors. Bubba Wallace, and being so open to the public about his feelings and opinions on what is happening to him, are seen in the many interviews he does, his public displays, and the addition of the Netflix show Race, which follows him on his life and struggles in the past 2 years. By putting his voice out there, he is creating testimony and starting the healing process, while dealing with those demons himself and fighting to create a more welcoming NASCAR environment. But it should not go without saying that Wallace is not alone, as there are other stories where athletes have given testimony and stood up for their race in light of their times and pressures. Take, for example, Hank Aaron, Serena Williams, Tommy Smith, and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympics, and of course, NASCAR's own Wendell Scott. Bubba Wallace adds his testimony among those of all these black athletes that came before him. Wendell Scott, he was the first black driver to win at NASCAR's top level, with Wallace being the second. Scott's only win coming in Jacksonville in 1964, a place they don't even race anymore. He was not officially called the winner of the race on a scoring error, and the trophy was instead given to the second place driver, a white guy, obviously, who got to kiss the white trophy girls. Scott was later quietly given the win and the prize money the night after the race. This was done out of a mixture of obvious racism and an actual concern over Scott's safety, as if he was officially called the winner of the track, and definitely if he kissed the trophy girls, he most likely would not have left that night with his life. Either way, there wouldn't be another Black Cup winner for 57 years. In Phyllis Alicia Perry's Stigmata, Lizzie, the main character, is given a quilt woven by her grandmother with her ancestors' history stitched onto it. This quilt connects her to those ancestors and their trauma and experiences. Much like that quilt, Bubba Wallace takes that weight and heads into the modern era. One race I want to specifically highlight, though, is his Truck Series win at Martinsville in 2014, where he ran a Wendell Scott tribute paint scheme. Though it isn't a completely black and white comparison, as Scott and Wallace are not related, the Super Truck's design parallels that of the quilt and Stigmata, carrying the history of blacks in the sport of NASCAR and the South as a whole, also representing the struggles that had to be overcome to see blacks at a racetrack, let alone see one lead laps, and then win a race. As he rolled into victory lane in that paint scheme, some of the wounds left from that history were healed, as Wendell Scott's struggles and sacrifices were not in vain, for his spiritual successor was now setting the pace. Later on, Bubba would only follow that up, heading further into the modern era, while racing at the top level of the sport, and as mentioned before, eventually winning, just as Wendell Scott had over half a decade earlier. But question is, has it completely healed? Has anything changed? And I would say that it's gotten better. I say with confidence that I find the crowds at racetracks to be much more diverse than I would have ever expected, or have seen in previous years, and I believe that all people should be able to enjoy racing. But there is still a very long way to go, and I don't think it will be ever fully healed, especially when there are certain people that feel a racetrack is a safe space for bigotry, and let's just say, political commentary. I mean, what flashes through your mind when you hear NASCAR? For most people, and certainly anyone who is not a God-fearing white American, it's images of the rebel flag and a generally unwelcoming atmosphere that flash through their mind. I went to the Geico 500 at Talladega this past weekend, and I saw a man who snuck in a Kiss My Rebel Ass ball cap with a rebel flag on it, which he turned backward, and behind him was an entire black family. It's these things that make me very sad, because the family was enjoying the race, audibly cheering on Chase Elliott and Bubba Wallace, and now they probably won't show up next year, or at the very least they'll watch from home instead. I know politics is what makes sports what it is, but when it is a matter of emotional and spiritual pain for others, it should go without saying that such beliefs are best left at home. As it reads in a Washington Post article about NASCAR's rebel flag ban back in 2020, for his efforts, Wallace has been inundated with extremes. He's had a surge of 30,000 new social media followers, many declaring newfound love for NASCAR, Wallace, and his number 43 Chevrolet. But he's also received plenty of condemnation and even threats. They see me as someone who's tearing down their heritage, Wallace said of fans who are irate about the ban. But we're not trying to close the door on you. We're opening the door to many others that want to be a part of this sport. So with this in mind, I personally think it'll take a few more years for it to be fully washed out of the NASCAR sphere. But it is something that needs to happen if NASCAR is to be successful. But I do genuinely believe it can happen, and that it's headed in the right direction with Bubba Wallace and other black drivers rising through the ranks, and even Lewis Hamilton in Formula One. I've been a fan for 2 years now, and I genuinely love racing. The atmosphere, the sounds, the stories, and I do believe it is a sport that can generally be enjoyed by all people. But the stigma and the particular brand established by it, and the South as a whole, needs to be completely broken down before that can happen. But this all led up to that one fateful rainy Monday, when I exclaimed to a sleepy college class that Bubba Wallace won his first NASCAR race, a man whom not a single soul in that classroom had ever even heard of, yet accomplished one of the most monumental things in all of 21st century sports. Though he's had his struggles since then, I will continue to keep my eye on Bubba heading through the 2022 NASCAR season, as he's come very close to victory lane this season, finishing second in the Daytona 500 for the second time in his career, and nearly winning Atlanta and Talladega. but it can only not work out so many times until it does. And I believe he will make it back to victory lane again. And following him, I'm sure many more black drivers in the future of NASCAR will eventually make it to victory lane as well. All in part thanks to him, Wendell Scott, and the many other black athletes that made their mark on history. Either way, I'll continue going to races and supporting the sport, as I believe it can be something truly great with the next generation of fans and turbulent young drivers like Bubba Wallace moving forward into the future.